Richard Shafsky on Coast to Coast AM. Richard, let's talk a little bit about the healing properties of these skulls. First of all, how does it work? How does it work to heal?
Well, George, the New Age Healy-Feely interpretation of how a skull can be used to heal actually falls very, very short of what the skull actually does. What a shaman would do is he would go into consultation. He would go into an altered state with the skull. And, for example, if he had a patient that had a particular disease or a particular injury, he would consult with the skull to perhaps come into contact with a deceased shaman on the other side or with an ET. He would present to him what the problem was, and then he could be directed, for example, to harvest a particular plant out in the jungle. And I also want to say the shaman does all of his harvesting at night in the jungle. He works with the aura, the light that comes off a plant to read its energy. And what he would do then is come back, select the plant, the particular herb or combination of herbs that were going to be necessary, come back, make up a concoction, and then present that to the patient. Usually it would be a cure. Now, the idea that so many have of passing the stone or the crystal over someone, that's not really how it worked. It was much more advanced than that. The shaman, like I say, he would consult, he would get the information, then he would do what was ever necessary to formulate the prescription and present it.
Did you have to touch the recipient, the one who was going to be healed? Did they have to touch the skull?
No. That was not necessary. See, a shaman is always doing his work in an altered state. He would take a tea, for example, that would allow him to be able to view not just the physical body, but also the light body of the person he was working with. So he could see where there was injury, so he could see where there was disease. And he would have the skull really, it would be off to the side. Now the skull, and he would have other crystals present also. He might hand one of those other crystals to the patient. The patient would take that into their hand, but nobody but the shaman was actually allowed to touch the skull. That was his and his alone. Now, a real skull worker, a real healer, develops a relationship, and they developed very close relationships with the skull so that they could interact very comfortably, very easily with those that they needed to consult. Then they would take the benefit of that consultation, pass it on to the patient. A good way to do a reading on a patient would be to hand them hand them a crystal, see what the light energy presented within the patient, and then go consult, come back with whatever the prescribed concoction was going to be that was going to do the healing.
Would every crystal, Richard, work the same way, or are these crystal skulls different? Have they been supercharged, for example?
They've been supercharged. Today we can work with various crystals various ways. The ones that are colored stones, for example, they can relate to particular organs in our body. They can relate to particular ailments. You can use them to affect certain things within our light body as well as our physical body. But, George, for yourself and for the audience to understand, the crystal skulls were like supercharged mainframe computers. In no way, shape, or form were they even similar in what they would do compared to, let's say, what a normal or even what an energized crystal would do.
Okay, so if one was just walking around with a small crystal in their pocket or something, not necessarily would do what these do.
No, wouldn't necessarily do it all. However, if one was trained and if they had a crystal that they were familiar with using, and if they did have the relationship with the shaman or with the crystal skull, then you could be transferring some healing properties into the crystal and have it be something that a person could carry, for example, and it could be sending out a particular frequency, maybe even on a radio wavelength frequency. That could be doing cellular, inter and intracellular communication within a person's body, and accelerate the human physiology, the human immune system. Could excite the human immune system to affect a healing process. That could be transferred through a normal crystal. That information could be directly coming from a crystal skull.
So there's no question in your mind these work. Now, of, let's say, the 13 that are out there, some may not be real. Is that correct?
Oh, I think there's many fakes that are out there. And that's not to say that the information that's in them is not credible, is not real, but I don't believe for a moment that all of the ones that are presented to actually be ancient crystal skulls are in fact ancient crystal skulls. Today there are a lot of people that are writing and researching, and most of them are repeating what was talked about early on by Frank Nosserino. His footsteps were gigantic. They were absolutely immense. And so much of what is said today was about the crystal skulls was actually presented by Frank 20, 30, 40 years ago. The ancient crystal skulls, I know the Mayan skull was one. I know that Max was one. I know that Shana Ra is one.
The one at the Smithsonian was deemed a fake, right?
Well, it was deemed a fake, but if one really takes a look at the research as to why they called it a fake, I'm not so sure that it really is. You see, some of these skulls were worked on in modern times. So we'll call modern times, let's say, within the last 500 years. And those could have left tool marks. That's not to say that the skull itself is a fake. I think the only way to really be able to determine that, George, is to have a real skull worker who really knows how to turn the skull on, to switch the channels, to put the right sound, the right light through it, to work with it that way, put on some good modern analytical equipment onto it, and let's see what comes up. That I think has to be done to determine whether one is fake or not.
You talked about images of the skulls last hour, and you wanted to elaborate a little bit about that.
Yes. What I wanted to convey is that the images, when you're looking at the images within the skull, now this is not like reading tea leaves. This is not like reading cloud formations. These images are very, very clear. There is no room for misinterpretation. So when I hear people say, "Oh, well, how do you know that what you're looking at is really what you're looking at, or is it just in your own mind's eye? Is it in your imagination?" And we do have equipment today, video equipment, that can record the images that are within the skulls. I know we did this 30 years ago. And, oh my gosh, there it is, exactly, precisely presented so that there's no room for misinterpretation. Now, those images are spectacular in what they present because they're not images that are just common to what we would see today. You can observe obviously Earth images. In fact, you can get some presentations of Earth just as if they were taken by a satellite that we're familiar with today. But you can also see other planets, George. You can also see other civilizations. I've personally looked out and seen the pyramids, for example, on the Giza Plateau at a time when there was a lot of activity going on.